This is the Program for Constitutional Government, or Unconstitutional Government, and our speaker today is Shep Melnick. Shep is the Thomas P. O'Neill Professor of American Politics. That's the chair named for the former speaker at his alma mater, Boston College. So this is an expert from a university where the chair is named for the expert of American politics in recent years. So, and he teaches a variety of courses on there at Boston College on courts and public policy, ideas and institutions in American politics. He's received his BA from Harvard in 1973 and his Ph.D. in 1980, where he worked with James Q. Wilson and Arthur Moss, I believe. And he's taught at Harvard and then at Brandeis. He's interested in the intersection between law and politics. So his first book was on the Clean Air Act, and it's called Regulation in the Courts. And his second, Between the Lines, is on the entitlement programs of the welfare state. And he's talking today on his forthcoming book, which is, I think, a wonderful effort, The Transformation of Title IX, Regulating Gender Equality in Education. He's also the co-chair of the Program for Unconstitutional Government, and he's been president of the New England Political Science Association. He's a longtime friend, and I think this new book of his is going to add to his renown. So with that, I leave it to Shep.
Thank you, Harvey. Actually, since I hate PowerPoint, I actually have a handout of an outline and a few cheat sheets about some of the initials I'm going to be using. But it's really great to be here, to see so many friends. And I particularly want to acknowledge Samantha Simmons, who's sitting in the back, who actually wrote her undergraduate thesis at Boston College on this topic. And when I started working on the book again, I went back and read her thesis to remind me of the things that we had learned together. She's now at Harvard Law School. Today I'm going to talk about the main argument of my book, Transformation of Title IX. If you want to see more, I have some flyers here. And it's been a real challenge for me to turn a 300-page book into a 30-minute talk. So I'm going to have a lot of details I'll leave out. I hope maybe we can cover some of that in the question and answer. And if that's not enough, then the book will be out in 2 weeks and you can read that. Not that I'm trying to plug it or anything.
No.
So let me start with a paradox. On the one hand, very few federal laws have been successful in meeting the original objective than Title IX. Enacted as part of an omnibus education bill in 1972, Title IX prohibits educational institutions that receive federal funding from discriminating on the basis of sex. As the doors of educational opportunity swung open, women rushed through. So, for example, in 1972, only 58% of college students were male and only 42% were female. By 2010, those numbers had flipped. Now 57% are female and only 43% male, and those numbers keep rising. Wouldn't be surprised in a few years we're up to 60% female. In 1970, men earned 8 times as many PhDs as women. Today, women earn more doctorates than do men. Once all but shut out of medical school and law school and dental school, women have now reached parity. And that will continue in part because women are doing so much better, I should say girls are doing so much better in elementary and secondary school. They have higher grades, they have higher aspirations, they take more AP courses, they participate in more extracurricular activities. As Thomas DePreet and Claudia Buckman said in their book, The Rise of Women, quote, "Women have not merely gained educational equality with men. On many fronts, they have surpassed men by a large and growing margin." So you'd think with these successes that Title IX wouldn't be particularly controversial anymore, but of course it's more controversial than ever. For years, intercollegiate athletics was by far the most contentious issue. As a matter of fact, so closely tied in the public mind are Title IX and athletics that there's a glossy women's catalog of athletic gear called Title IX, which I think is the only women's catalog named after a section of the U.S. Code. I might be wrong about that, but starting in 2011, sexual harassment regulations rose to the top of the controversial list. The Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education issued detailed sexual harassment guidelines and launched hundreds of very well-publicized investigations, including several investigations of Harvard. In 2016, OCR issued a Dear Colleague letter on transgender rights, requiring schools to allocate all sex-segregated facilities, such as restrooms, showers, dorm rooms, on the basis of students' gender identification rather than their biological sex. Now, these initiatives received a lot of criticism, and not just from conservatives. The 2016 Republican platform devoted an entire section to Title IX, charging the original purpose of Title IX had been, quote, perverted by bureaucrats and by the current President of the United States to impose a social and cultural revolution upon the American people. But they were joined by civil libertarians and a number of bar associations, legal scholars, including some legal scholars at Harvard, and surprisingly, groups of university professors saying that these were a serious threat to due process and freedom of speech. The Trump administration quickly withdrew the Dear Colleague letter on transgender rights. A few months later, Secretary of Education DeVos withdrew the Obama guidelines on sexual harassment as well. And she announced, quote, the era of rule by letters is over. She promised to do future guidance and rulemaking through Administrative Procedure Act notice and comment rulemaking, which means that this is going to be dragged on not just for months, but probably for years, the current rulemaking. Meanwhile, the transgender issue is being fought out in the courts, and Congress is considering legislation on sexual harassment. What this indicates is this is going to be a set of controversies for many years to come. It's not something that the Trump administration put to an end. Now, there's little danger that the remarkable educational gains of women will be reversed, no matter what happens on Title IX. They were the result of a profound cultural shift that began in the 1960s, and that Title IX itself was a part of this profound cultural shift. That's why it wasn't controversial when it passed. Before 1972, colleges that had previously been all male opened their doors to women, and that continued after 1972, despite the fact that Title IX does not apply to admissions to private undergraduate schools. That's why Wellesley can be continue to be all female. So there is a huge cultural shift. DePreet and Buckman have data that shows, quote, the reversal from a male advantage to a female advantage in educational achievement has unfolded in most industrialized countries, not just the United States, and most of those countries don't have anything that looks like Title IX. A key to understanding this paradox, I'll argue, is noting how distant current controversies are on Title IX from education as conventionally understood. Title IX originally focused on what goes on in the classroom. Women being barred from programs, courses, not being admitted, quite blatant discrimination against female faculty members. But that is no longer what the issues are. The focus initially shifted from the classroom to the playing field, athletics, and then shifted from the playing field to bathrooms and bedrooms. So we're quite a distance from ordinary understanding of education. So no longer is the primary goal of the regulatory regime to eliminate institutional barriers to educational opportunity for women and girls. Now it has changed the way all of us, students, faculty, staff, and the public at large, think about sex differences, gender roles, and sexuality in general. That's what I try to describe in my book, and I'll try to quickly go through these three areas: athletics, sexual harassment, and transgender issues to show how this evolved. Now, tracing this transformation is not very easy because there's of the very peculiar way in which policy is made under Title IX. The law authorizes the Office for Civil Rights to establish regulations to carry out its task. Regulations have to be, or are supposed to be, carried out according to the Administrative Procedures Act, notice and comment rulemaking procedure, and Title IX goes even beyond that. To quite an unusual requirement says these have to be signed by the President, because they're very important regulations. The last time OCR followed all of these requirements for Title IX major regulation was 1975. Instead of following these procedures, it has relied almost exclusively on unilaterally announced interpretations, clarifications, and dear colleague letters. Now, this guidance wouldn't have had much punch if the federal courts had refused to defer to them. Title IX says almost nothing about the role of courts. The only enforcement mechanism it creates is the funding cutoff. The agency is supposed to deny federal funding to schools that violate Title IX. But the number of times over the last 5 decades that OCR has cut off federal funding is precisely 0. So every time your university administrators tell you that you've got to obey this because otherwise we'll lose federal funding, tell them that's simply not true, and they know it's not true. The funding cutoff has never been used because it's too administratively cumbersome and it's too politically perilous. And it tends to hurt the people the regulations are designed to protect. So instead, the Supreme Court responded to these problems by discovering what it calls an implied private right of action in the statute, which means that the regulations and the law can be enforced through private suits for money damages and for injunctions. This has been the major way in which the federal government has put teeth, enforcement teeth, into Title IX. But it also means that if the courts defer to the agency, this dear colleague letter or clarification becomes something very close to binding law. As a result, Title IX regulations developed through a process I call institutional leapfrogging. That is, judges and administrators take a series of short steps, building upon each other, relying on the authority of the other. So pretty soon you've got a big change in policy with everyone, here's the thing I want to say, everyone denying that anything has changed. OCR never does anything new. So, for example, the White House described the sexual harassment regulations as groundbreaking, and OCR said it's merely continuation of existing policy. The rules on athletics that evolved over 40 years, OCR denies they've ever done anything new, and even on the transgender regulations, which are pretty startlingly new, just long-established policy, which means that they don't have to explain the nature of the change, they don't have to give any evidence, they don't have to consider alternatives, and there's basically no explanation in these letters of why this rather than something else. What part of the result of that, it takes what I call policy archaeology to kind of trace back all of these changes, which is a major reason my book is so long. Now, let me start with athletics because this is a really good example of this institutional leapfrogging. And start with the question of why did college sports get so much attention? It's not because sports is an integral part of education. At best, it's a useful extracurricular activity. And at worst, it's a serious distraction and a deeply corrupting influence. Here, I differ from Harvey. I am much more on the deeply corrupting influence side. So why sports? Well, it's because this is one of the only areas of education that we segregate by sex. In math class, political science class, we expect everyone to compete and you get the grade. I don't know, maybe you don't get the grade you deserve, but there is some competition there. But if we said to a female basketball player, you're not as good as the biggest and strongest guys, tough luck, you're not on the team, I don't think any of us would consider that to be particularly fair. So the question is, when you have separate but equal, what is equal? The rules that tried to address this in 1975 were broad but vague. They applied not just to college, but to elementary and secondary schools. They applied not just to varsity, but to everything from fitness classes to club to JV and everything else. I should say that one of the reasons my only contribution to this cover was to insist that the woman have a lacrosse stick. And that's because my daughter played JV lacrosse here. So I'm quite a supporter of women's sports. The other key thing of the 1975 regulation was that they said that the facilities and opportunities available to women athletes should fairly reflect the, quote, relative interests and abilities of male and female students. They didn't make clear, it wasn't clear what that meant, and it took 20 years of this institutional leapfrogging to have more specific rules. When the regulations came out, they differed from the 1975 rules in two crucial ways. One of them has gotten a lot of debate, and the other basically has gone unnoticed. So let me start with the most controversial. Federal judges and administrators rejected this relative interest and capabilities argument in favor of what's often called the Parity Standard. This means schools must provide increase the number of female varsity athletes or reduce the number of male varsity athletes until the percentage of female varsity athletes reflects the proportion of females in the entire student body. Schools can escape this mandate by claiming that female students are less interested in varsity sports than the males. So if women constitute 55 to 60% of the undergraduate student body, as is often the case now, then the target needs to be 55 to 60% female varsity athletes, and where you have varsity scholarships, varsity scholarships. The clearest and most important explanation of this standard came in the First Circuit's 1996 decision in Brown University versus Cohen. Women's level of interest in competitive sports, the court asserted, quote, reflects women's historical lack of opportunities to participate in sports. A result, I'm again quoting, to assert that Title IX permits institutions to provide fewer athletic participation opportunities for women than for men based upon the premise that women are less interested in sports than men is to ignore the fact that Title IX was enacted in order to remedy discrimination that results from stereotyped notions of women's interests and abilities. To cure discrimination results from stereotyped notions of women's interests and abilities. Since interests and abilities, quote, evolve as a function of opportunity and experience, universities have an affirmative duty not just to create more women's teams, but to recruit more students to fill those teams and to give them scholarships if they offer those scholarships to men. All of the circuit courts that address the issue agreed. Ninth Circuit Judge Cynthia Holcomb Hall put it this way. She said, this approach recognized that women's attitudes toward sports are socially constructed and have been limited by discrimination and gender stereotypes. Congress passed Title IX to combat such discrimination and stereotypes. So this was the first appearance of this argument that the goal of Title IX was to change stereotypes, not just those embedded in institutional policies, but those held by current and prospective students and the public at large, because you had to increase interest among prospective students as well as current students. The famous line from the field, "Movie of Dreams," became the motto of the advocates for more women's slots: build it and they will come. This gets repeated all the time in the literature. Create more college teams, recruit more athletes, and you provide powerful incentives for girls to become more serious about sports and thus to reject images of women as weak and passive. Now, the question about whether these interests and abilities were socially constructed or not was the controversial part. What was seldom examined, and I think was equally important, is why did OCR and the courts focus on this very narrow slice of athletics? Very few women at big universities play varsity sports. University of Texas at Austin has tens of thousands of students. Most state universities have very large enrollment. At these schools, only 300 to 400 women play varsity athletics. I realize that at Ivy League schools it's much larger, but at many schools it's a very tiny slice. the women who play sports at college is a tiny slice of those who play sports in elementary school and high schools. But we focused on one tiny part. Now, the other thing about varsity sports is it's really expensive. If I gave you the expenses on these things, you'd be astounded. Now, at Ivy League schools and places like Bowdoin and Williams, the real expense, of course, is the real valuable thing is admission slots. That's what is really rare, and that's in some ways the biggest expense of increasing the number of varsity athletes. So why this limited focus? In part, it's a result of administrative convenience. Varsity slots are easy to count, although not quite as easy as you might think. And figuring out the relative weight of, say, of a yoga class and football team, that's pretty hard. So they said, I would just focus on varsity. But also, interest groups played a crucial role here, and a key role was played by the NCAA. I said earlier Catherine Lehman was maybe the villain in this book, but even more, I'd say the NCAA is the villain of the book. NCAA tried to kill Title IX, and they failed. And in 1980, they figured if you can't beat them, join them. We'll just take over women's sports. We'll have all of these championships. That's what we do. We run high visibility championships. So they bought off colleges, take them out of this organization run by women. They had a much different understanding of the role of athletics. And the schools flocked to the NCAA. And the NCAA created championships, they created a gender equity task force, and they became a major proponent of what they call emerging women's sports, and other people call white girl sports, because they're almost all done by girls in prep schools and very affluent suburban schools, like equestrian. What the NCAA would not do and cannot do is to reduce spending on football and basketball, because that's where they get their money, and that's where the conferences get their money. The women's advocacy groups, most importantly the Women's Sports Foundation and Women's National Law Center, went along in what I would describe as a tacit deal. They would jointly promote highly competitive women's sports, not by cutting men's programs, by pushing for ever more spending in recruiting on athletics. Eleanor Schmiel, some of you might remember that she was former president of National Organization of Women, put it this way: dropping men's teams is a violation of the spirit and the letter of Title IX. The purpose of saying you're not going to discriminate is not to limit opportunities of the other class. We should not be talking about a zero-sum game. In other words, expand the athletic pie. OCR has repeatedly insisted in cutting men's teams to meet Title IX targets is a disfavored practice. Now, part of the explanation for why some of these women's groups did this, especially the Women's Sports Foundation, is quite clear. This is an organization made of professional women athletes. And they think that, that having more professional women athletes is terrific. And they think the colleges should serve as a farm team for Olympic sports and for professional women's teams. That has the same attitude as the NFL. But also the National Women's Law Center has bought into this, saying that sports are only useful if they're highly competitive. So, for example, when Florida made flag football for girls an interscholastic sport, the National Women's Law Center objected to this. Because they said there are no women's varsity teams in college. And what we should do is preparing people to get varsity scholarships and go in and play in college. The former president of the Women's Sports Foundation said that girls get educational benefit from sports only if they take them seriously. That's the one thing that makes sports such an important experience. You're always striving for the next rung. So you're trying, if you're at the high school level, you're looking for college, you're looking for pros. And that was the attitude that has dominated. Now, why this? I think at the heart of this lies the view that if you're trying to promote new role models for women, to defeat existing stereotypes of weakness and passivity, you want highly visible role models. College sports is valuable because it's so visible. through college sport, we'll see these inspiring models. And girls will realize that's the ticket to college and to scholarship. But what if colleges built women's sports teams and nobody came? Then you'll have to take steps to increase the audience. I'll give you two examples. In the Obama administration, negotiated a large number of agreements with colleges on sports. It didn't get very much publicity, but that was they negotiated a lot of them. And a number of them said you have to take greater steps to publicize women's games. So, for example, Rutgers had to provide equal athletic opportunities for women of both sexes with regard to publicity, which meant they had to hire more sports information personnel to cover women's sports. And OCR then would monitor them to make sure they're giving equal coverage to men in women's sports. The target of this, of course, was not students or faculty, but the public at large. One other example, in 2012, the Seventh Circuit required an Indiana high school team to schedule more girls' basketball teams on Fridays and Saturdays. It argued that relegating girls' teams to non-prime time slots results, quote, in a loss of audience, fosters feelings of inferiority that oppresses girls' interest in basketball. Disparate scheduling creates a cyclical effect that stifles community sports, prevents the development of a fan base, and discourages females from participating in traditionally male-dominated sports. And Title IX requires undoing these stereotypes. Now, is spending a lot of money on a small number of female athletes good for women's education? After fighting a very long and losing battle in the First Circuit, Brown's president, Vartan Gregorian, bitterly concluded that by judicial fiat, women's sports have risen past all other priorities, including undergraduate scholarships, faculty salaries, and libraries. More money for athletic scholarships or more slots for athletes meant fewer slots, less money for mathematicians, musicians, and most importantly, political scientists. And given women's superior academic performance these days, a disproportionate number of these people will be women. I don't know if any of you have read this study by William Bowen and his co-authors on women's sports, but I'll just quickly say that they found that in the 1970s, female athletes had high school records similar to non-athletes. They had college records similar to non-athletes, and they tended to go to graduate school more often, and they end up making more money. So actually they were performing extremely well. By the time Title IX took hold in the 1990s, they went back and they looked and they said the female athletes have significantly worse high school records. For some sports like hockey, quite a bit lower. Given the worse record of high school, they underperform in college, and they found that the reason for that is because they devoted their entire young lives especially to one sport, and haven't developed other interests, and they don't develop them in college. Bowen and his co-authors say, women athletes appear to have caught up with their male counterparts, a dubious distinction. What I find remarkable in this story is how little thought was given to the question, is this good for women's education? Second issue was sexual harassment. It took a quarter of a century for OCR to issue guidelines on sexual harassment and another 2 decades for any significant enforcement to begin. Now, sexual harassment differs from athletics in 2 key ways. One is that it's not really educational institutions' policies directly that are involved. It's the behavior of thousands of students, faculty members, and staff. And the requirement has become that universities have a responsibility to monitor and control that behavior, much of which take place in private. So that's a much more difficult bureaucratic task. And the second is, it never been very clear of why sexual harassment is sexual discrimination. At first, court said, well, it might be really bad, but it's not discriminatory. But then the court started to say, well, it is discriminatory if you target someone because of their sex. So if a heterosexual male targets a woman they're doing so because of her sex. You can say the thing, a woman or a man, or a gay man against another man, they're targeted because of their sex. But what about a bisexual harasser? The court said, not covered. Because they're undiscriminating. I wish I could say I was making this up, but Robert Bork, when he was on the D.C. Circuit, heard one of these cases, and he wrote, "This bizarre result indicates that Congress didn't mean to cover sexual harassment. Quote, had Congress been aiming at sexual harassment, it seems unlikely that a woman would have been protected from unwelcome heterosexual and lesbian advances, but left unprotected when a bisexual attacks." But eventually the court said, we're not going to deal with it. Everything's covered. We're not going to make this silly exception. But they really couldn't agree on why. So disagreements about the why led to big disagreements about what should be done. Now, is a good example of the leapfrogging that took place. First, the EEOC issued regulations on sexual harassment. Then the courts adopted those under Title VII. Then the courts extended those to Title IX. Then OCR adopted what the court had said under Title IX. And basically the model that was initially developed was based on tort law, and the courts felt very comfortable with this. So there were two key assumptions I'll just spell out because they were later changed. One was sexual harassment is largely a problem of bad apples, a few bad apples, mainly men. And so employers and schools should say, these are things that are prohibited, and here is how people can complain about them, and then you're going to get rid of these bad apples. So that's number one. Number two was, if you change the incentives that schools face through the danger of monetary damages, they'll have strong incentives to do this. Fairly typical tort liability understanding. And when OCR first issued regulations on this in 1997, they endorsed that tort liability standard. But then, in 1998 and 1999, the Supreme Court issued two decisions on this topic, and they took a much different view. They said, number one, schools are liable only if they have actual knowledge of the misconduct and are deliberately indifferent to it. So that's a really, really lenient standard. They also said, court should award damages, quote, only for harassment that is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that effectively bars the victim's access to an educational opportunity. And Justice O'Connor said that judges should refrain from second-guessing the disciplinary decisions made by school administrators. So it was a fairly conservative opinion. The Supreme Court decision received scathing reviews in the law reviews among women's groups. One law review said, why has the Supreme Court allowed schools to stick their head in the sand? And on the very last day of the Clinton administration, actually I think 18 hours before the inauguration of George W. Bush, OCR published midnight regulations or guidelines saying they would not go along with what the Supreme Court, how the Supreme Court had interpreted the act. They claimed that the Supreme Court's decision applied only to court decisions for monetary damages, not to administrative regulations saying what schools had to do to receive federal funds. That the agency explained it would no longer describe a school's compliance in terms of liability law. Instead of explaining what schools could do to escape liability, OCR spelled out in detail steps schools must take to, quote, prevent, eliminate, and remedy sexual harassment. That's just think of it. Prevent, eliminate, and remedy sexual harassment. In a big school, are you ever going to eliminate sexual harassment, sexual assault, even if the worst? Probably not. Now, this ignored, it was a pretty clever legal argument, but ignored the fact that OCR relied on the courts to enforce its rules. So if they couldn't go to court, how could they enforce them? And so the Bush administration first said, these rules are invalid, but then they said, got pushback, and they basically said, it doesn't matter. They're unenforceable. We're going to ignore them. So they remained in limbo for a decade. Now, I mentioned this shift in part to show that the OCR now is quite out of line with the Supreme Court, but because OCR's rejection of the tort liability model paralleled many feminist legal scholars' understanding of sexual harassment, most notably Catherine McKinnon, who wrote the leading book on this topic. And McKinnon always argued that tort law was the wrong way to go because it, quote, considers individual and compensable something as fundamentally social and should be eliminated. By treating the incidents if they were outrages particular to an individual woman, rather than integral to her social status or as a working woman, it fails to analyze the relevant dimensions of the program. Sexual harassment, she said, was part of the larger pattern of subordination of women. Quote, women historically have been required to exchange sexual services for material survival in one form or another, prostitution and marriage, as well as sexual harassment in different ways of institutionalizing the arrangement. To say that prostitution, marriage, and sexual harassment are all part of the same complex, I think, is probably a much more controversial statement than OCR realized it was getting into. But with strong support from the White House and new emerging advocacy groups, OCR in 2011 launched a new initiative, which the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the time described as a new paradigm. And it had two parts of the subordination model that McKinnon described. One was the idea that this is a pervasive problem, part of a rape culture and epidemic of assault. So it's not just a few bad apples, it's everywhere. According to the White House Council on Women and Girls, quote, sexual assault is pervasive because our culture still allows it to persist. Consequently, violence prevention can't focus on the perpetrators and the survivors alone. It has to involve everybody. Frequently, you have to have a sea change in cultural attitudes. So that's number one. Number two, schools have been so complicit in condoning the rape culture that a few tweaks to incentives are not going to do the job. You have to build new institutions, autonomous Title IX compliance offices with lots and lots of responsibilities. Now, these regulations have been very controversial, especially on due process and free speech grounds. Some of you probably know the work of book by Laura Kipnis, the book by Stuart Taylor and Casey Johnson, and some really excellent reporting by Emily Yoffa in The Atlantic. But I'm not going to. I just want to focus on one thing I think has been overlooked, which is the regulatory mandates on training, remediation, and prevention. I assume every student has been through this, every faculty member has been through this multiple times. Schools have to have training for everybody, students, staff, faculty, investigators, adjudicators, police, resident assistants. So one advantage of this for Title IX offices, it's a lot of training, so you have to hire more people. I gather Harvard is up to about 50 Title IX coordinators and assistant coordinators, something like that. This training attempts to explain to students how to draw the line between acceptable and unacceptable, and what many government documents have said, healthy and mutually respectful sexual relationships. I give you a bunch of examples, but in some ways my favorite is University of Georgia advises, if you're not accustomed to communicating with your partner about sex and sexual activity, the first few times may feel awkward. But practice makes perfect. Be creative and spontaneous. Don't give up. Now, the problem with that is that OCR said has repeatedly rejected sexual overtures constitutes harassment, right? So if you follow their advice, you could be charged with harassment. Jacob Gerson and Jeannie Suk at the law school wrote, I think, a very important law review article, California Law Review, and they described the job of what they call the sex bureaucracy. And I want to quote, I think, an informative part of their article. The people who run these sex bureaucracies are not simply training students on the rules of rape, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. Rather, they are instructing on, advising on, counseling on, defining, monitoring, investigating, and adjudicating questions of sexual desire. sexual violence education and prevention programs rapidly morphing into sex instruction reminiscent of the guidance provided by sex therapists like Dr. Ruth. This jibes well, they continue with the public health framework, so strongly influence the federal regulatory orientation. Since the sex bureaucracy's role is regulating health and safety, explanations of consent easily lead to instruction about what is healthy or positive in sexual relations. So this was what it means to change the culture. Now, knowing what goes on in these training programs is not easy. They vary a lot. I assume that some are pretty good and some are not so good. But most schools keep these protocols secret. I'm not sure how you're going to train people and keep the protocol secret, but they have been less than forthcoming. But one thing I want to point out is a lot of these programs try to re-educate students about the meaning of masculinity and femininity. And I would just give one example. I could give an example from Harvard, but I won't, out of delicacy for your feelings. So I'll give an example from Princeton. Princeton in 2017 advertised a job for an interpersonal violence clinician and men's engagement manager. The person will develop programs challenging gender stereotypes in those belief systems and social constructs that contribute to violence. Candidates for the position must, quote, possess knowledge about the challenges and privileges of male identity formation and expertise in social justice issues. This language is quite common in these formats. I think this political theory behind, you guys are expert in social justice issues. If you read Harvey's book, I think you'll be expert in masculinity and femininity. So this is a job opportunity here. Now, the Trump administration withdrew these guidelines, but all the schools said, almost every school has said, we're not changing anything until we have some clear guidance. But as political science, we know once you create a bureaucracy with this mission, they're going to fight to retain their power. And most universities, no matter what the Trump does, they're going to remain as they are. So finally, I'll do this very quickly, transgender issue. In these other areas, regulation took years, decades to develop, but for the transgender issue, it emerged with really startling rapidity. I was writing the final version of the book, all of a sudden this appeared, so I had to actually spend a fair amount of time revising part of the book. Now, for decades, almost everyone had agreed that the non-discrimination provisions in Title VII and Title IX do not extend to sexual orientation or transgender status. Up until 2014, President Obama agreed with this and said, if we're going to regulate these things, we need new legislation. By 2014, it became clear it was not going to pass, and he changed his tune and basically issued an executive order on transgender discrimination. But the foundations for this were laid a few years earlier by the courts. And again, we see this kind of leapfrogging. Starting around 2000, federal courts began to hold that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act on employment discrimination prohibits discrimination against transgender employees. And they relied almost entirely on dicta in a plurality decision announced by the Supreme Court in 1969 in a Title VII case called Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins. There, 4 members of the court agreed that failure to promote a woman for not acting in a sufficiently ladylike fashion constitutes sex discrimination. An employer violates Title VII, the court said, or at least 4 members of the court said, if that employer's discrimination were likely influenced by sex stereotyping. According to Justice Brennan, quote, Congress intended to strike at the entire spectrum of disparate treatment of men and women resulting from sex stereotyping. Now, the case didn't involve gender identity, but the words of the plurality decision indicated that if you are not hired or fired, let's say a man is not hired or fired, because he wears a dress, wears makeup, and requires people to call him she, that obviously is discrimination based on a stereotype. People might not think that men should wear dresses and wear makeup and be referred to as she. So that wasn't such a big leap if you take the Supreme Court's starting point. OCR first addressed the issue only in 2010 in a Dear Colleague letter on bullying and said, it can be sex discrimination if students are harassed either for exhibiting what is perceived as stereotypical characteristic for their sex or for failing to conform to stereotypical notions of masculinity and femininity. So this language of stereotypical behavior keeps coming back. At first, OCR limited its investigations to instances of bullying. Reasonably enough. But then we reached settlements with these schools that said, as part of the agreement, you have to provide access to sex-segregated facilities on the basis of gender identity, the subjective sense of gender, rather than biological sex. That was a pretty big leap, because in the employment context, the question was, can you prohibit take a job away or benefits away from someone who is transgender. But no one claimed that transgender students should be thrown out of school. I mean, that would be illegal, probably unconstitutional. I don't think anyone would support it. The question is a really narrow one. How do you allocate access to sex-segregated facilities? And these sex-segregated facilities were clearly allowed both by the statute and by regulations. What OCR said was, when you segregate by sex, as the regulations say, you can't segregate by biological sex. You can only segregate by gender identity. Now, legally, that's a pretty hard claim to make, because it says when you say sex, we actually mean gender identity. But of course, the term gender identity was created to differentiate it from biological sex. That was a hard legal argument to make, but I should say that most courts have made it anyway. And I just point out the language of the 2016 Dear Colleague letter was really uncompromising. It said any desire to accommodate others' discomfort cannot justify a policy that denies transgender students the right to choose sex-segregated facility or athletic teams or the preferred names or pronouns. Now this DCL was enjoined immediately by the Federal District Court in Texas, and then withdrawn by the Trump administration. But Seventh Circuit after that said, well, what OCR said was demanded by the statute. And again, the language about no sex stereotyping was at the heart of the decision. So this is going to continue to go on for some time. Shortly after she left, the Office of Civil Rights Assistant Secretary Catherine Lehman told an interviewer, the bathroom question was never just about bathrooms. It is about who that child is at school and how that child will be perceived and seen. I just want to emphasize how that person will be perceived and seen by teachers, by staff, and by the public at large. We need to change our perceptions of what gender and gender identification is. Now, the transgender issue is not going to affect very much what goes on in public schools. There aren't that many transgendered students. I think everyone says they should be dealt with sympathetically and individually. But I think it highlights the way that regulatory initiatives have changed over time, and also how they're partly at war with each other. So we were asked to believe that any off-color joke or wayward glance can be so threatening as to inhibit someone's education. But we should not, a girl or woman should not be threatened by having someone with male anatomy walking around in the shower. That seems a very odd understanding of what's threatening. The current regulations allow a person with a male physique to play on women's teams, despite the fact that we have segregation by sex in sports because we think there's a biological difference. And most importantly, and this is the one that I find most disturbing, if you look at what's happened with competitive sports, and I would just, gymnastics, swimming, why was it that really grotesque sexual assault was allowed in these programs? And one of the big reasons is because the school and the athletes, and to some extent even the parents, are so intent about having a highly competitive, successful program, they look the other way. And I just find this to be a really serious problem. That's what's happening in Michigan State right now. So how did we get here? I'll sum up by saying there are basically 4 factors are important. First was this logic of expansion, the powerful argument that if you want to establish true equality of opportunity, you have to eliminate all social preconceptions about what sex is that might limit the aspirations of female students. We got to get at the root of the problem, and the root of the problem is how people think about sex. Second was the convoluted process that allowed this very gradual expansion without much explanation. The third was that various interest groups put their own spin on the program. And finally, the lack of opposition from the regulated schools. Schools put up no opposition, especially colleges, but private public schools as well. Regulators were often pushing on an open door. Therefore, there was really no one to force the issue to be debated. Now, all of these issues of providing equal athletic opportunity, dealing sympathetically with those experiencing gender dysphoria, and dealing with the problem of sexual assault, these are all important issues. But I think we have to pay attention to, one, what the proper response is. Second, what the proper role of the federal government is. And third, is this good for women's education? And I think in a lot of the times, it's not. So let the debate begin.
Thanks, Shep. Could there possibly be any questions? Sure.
Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm very glad to have read your book chapter, and thanks for organizing this. And I'm in the physics department, and normally I don't actually have a relevant question that has anything to do with my work, but as of yesterday, the National Science Foundation said that they were now going to hold grant recipients of the universities accountable under Title IX standards, and they actually used that language. But they also said that they were not going to conduct investigations themselves, but we're going to rely on universities to do so, and they would only suspend funding if the accusation were serious enough that the researcher were facing serious academic sanction from their own institution under Title IX, which is like, I don't know how you could design a worse statement, right? Because if you have blind accusation and then you get suspended, like any number of these far left progressive professors have been over the last, couple of years or whatever, then the NSF can cut your funding. But then they're not going to investigate. How are they going to cut your funding? So what happens if you're in a lab and you're supporting 5 graduate students on your NSF grant? Do they all lose their salaries? Because it's unbelievable. At the same time, right, we have to say that, women and men are not any different, or if you're Larry Summers, you lose your job. Yet, as reported in this right-wing rag, The Guardian, in London, Oxford University now gives women 15 minutes more on their physics exams. My natural question was, if you're intersex, then you only get 7.5 minutes? Can you trans before the exam, get your 15 minutes, and self-identify the other way afterward? And yet, for all of these, bureaucratic interventions, participation at the highest levels in all of the physical sciences and non-biological STEM fields is down after decades of having this rammed down our throats, right? So that was the utterly politically correct question I wanted to ask you,
sure.
and if you could comment. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I had read recently about this 15-minute extra for women. It's kind of, my view is I don't need it, but I do. You raised an interesting issue about sanctions, and actually something that I had not explained earlier. I kind of left this big gap, which is on if OCR relies so much on legal sanctions, how could they get away with diverting from the Supreme Court? Your example raised an interesting possibility. The Office of Civil Rights and Department of Education has control primarily over big grants, which they don't dare take away. But if the National Science Foundation can say just your grant gets withdrawn, that's more politically feasible. But so I think how these things are structured has a lot to do with enforcement. I'll just quickly give the answer. Why is it that all these schools complied despite the fact that if they'd gone to court, they would have won? And the answer is that the Office of Civil Rights came up with a really brilliant enforcement strategy, and it had 2 parts. The first is make all the investigations public, which was a big deviation from the past. Before, investigations had only been made public at the end, and now that they were going to be made public at the beginning, and they started off by investigating all the big-name schools and showed everyone, this can happen to you. and probably because the big-name schools were more likely to cave in quickly. The other part of the enforcement strategy was to say that if we get a complaint by a single student, that will be turned into an investigation of the university as a whole. And these investigations are extremely long and expensive. They go on for years. Some of them gone on for 5 or 6 years. So you're spending money directly, but also your reputation is being damaged along the way. And the third part of it was that as part of the agreements they negotiated, there are very, very detailed rules about the Office of Title IX Coordinator. It has to be autonomous. It has to do all of these things. It has to have very close relations with OCR and check. OCR has to check with almost everything they do. And they've built up these networks of like-minded professionals across universities and with government agencies. It was almost as if they'd read James Q. Wilson's book, Bureaucracy, and figure out how do you create a bureaucracy that is going to remain in place for a very long time. So they were quite, and this turned out to be very effective. So one of the things the Trump administration said is we're going to change this enforcement strategy. We're going to go back to the old way. So an individual complaint is just an individual complaint. And that the advocacy groups were outraged by this because they understood the extent to which that really cut down the enforcement capability of the agency.
I have two questions. The early rulings, which seem to be about 40 years old, about women's sports, that when you raised the question that girls aren't as interested in sports, the answer was, well, there just hasn't been enough exposure. But now we've had 40 years of it. Has anybody proposed doing any studies to find out whether the attitudes have changed, or is this something just inherent in the difference between men and women with implications for changing the program? The second question is, supposing the school just says, look, we believe in equality, the baseball team is going to have tryouts, all featherless bipeds on the campus can come and try, play, and the top 15 or whatever it is make the team, end of story.
Right, that's what the NCAA actually proposed at the beginning, because they knew what the result would be. There might be, maybe in Division 1A, there might be one female place kicker on the football team. That's not going to fly, I got to say. Your first point about what if we tried to do more studies of current interest in among women after 40 years of changed attitude towards sports. The Bush administration tried that. They created a commission to study this, and then they issued new guidelines in 2005, I think, that said schools can do a survey of the interests and abilities of female students and male students. And that's the way to judge relative interest and abilities. They came out with very detailed survey methods. They were attacked, obviously, by women's advocacy groups, but most importantly by the NCAA. And then the NCAA said schools, don't use this, because what we really need to do is get up to parity with male and female. So the political support for that is extremely limited. Now, let me say, I hope I didn't distort the current situation too much. The goal is this parity standard. So if 55% undergraduates, 55% women athletes, that's what they keep being pushed to do. And you can't eliminate any women's teams. You can't add any men's teams until you get there. But most schools have not gotten there. I think the average is now about 43% of varsity athletes being female. So they keep being pushed, but there does seem to be some limit. Actually, let me give you one example of why it's hard. Partly I think this shows an important thing: women students have more sense than males. Women, if they're on a team and they're always sitting on the bench, quit. Because they got other things going on in their lives. They actually might be studying. Men, if they're on the bench, are just so happy to be part of the team. So, so this leads to a big thing about when do you count who's a varsity athlete, the beginning of the season, the end of the season, middle of the season. So, but there does seem to be a big difference between men and women on this. And, it might be because, women tend to be more interested in sports that you can continue after you graduate. If you, after you play football in high school and college, you're not going to play football much after. But you can play tennis and you can do yoga and you can do rock climbing. So, again, I think
it really leads to a basic question, which is, what if the stereotypes are right?
yes, right.
Shep, thanks for a clear, thorough presentation. I'm unclear on how this has been enforced. If no money has ever been withdrawn, is there just lots of private lawsuits that would endanger and the publicity that surrounds those? Is that what's done, as well as the voluntary cooperation?
Right, yeah. So just kind of fill out the enforcement side of it. Initially, the private right of action was only for injunctive relief, so that you have to do this. But starting in 1992, the court said, and damages. The lawyers were, there's something kind of odd about this, because the court said the less clear the right of action, the broader the damages, which is an odd situation. But so let me the Brown University, that Brown was sued for cutting a couple of teams, actually demoting them from varsity to club. Not eliminating them, just demoting them. By the end of the case, they had to add a variety of new teams. They had to, and it cost, someplace in the book I have the numbers, it cost several $1 million. The Merrimack College, just a little north of here, was sued, and it ended up costing him, I think, $6 million to expand various teams. For a small school, that's a lot of money. So it's pretty dangerous to get sued, so it's better to come into voluntary compliance. So that's one mechanism. And the second mechanism, which is used in sexual harassment, is what I just described, which is kind of investigate, damage reputation, require a very expensive monitoring, and that is another incentive. But, schools didn't resist that much. So that's why you didn't need a lot of enforcement a lot of the time.
Now with Me Too, it doesn't seem you need any government involvement at all.
Right, yeah.
The accusation is enough.
Right.
And the power of shame.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have mixed feelings about it. There's constant danger now that just being named is going to be, people are going to assume you're guilty. But part of the problem with the Title VII and Title IX rules is that the number of people who are willing to actually to issue a complaint was really small. We know it's a very tiny percentage of people who've suffered some fairly serious abuse. So I think the big question is, can you encourage people to come forward with at the same time having some fair process, which is very difficult in public opinion, that's going to distinguish the cases that have merit from those that do not. Peter?
Thanks, Shep, for the talk. The bathroom issue sort of seems like the reductio ad absurdum, this approach that people are going to be able to use the bathroom, not of their biological sex, but of how they self-identify. It seems like that would be inviting problems, incidents. We don't hear a lot about that. Are incidents occurring? Are they not being reported? What's going on with that?
I wish I had a good answer to that. I think the numbers are really tiny, and my wife's a psychologist, and she sometimes deals with kids who have gender dysphoria, and most of those kids don't want to. Let's say it's a woman transitioning to male. They don't want to be in a men's bathroom. They don't want to be in men's showers, and so you have individual facilities, and most schools have said, that's what we're going to do. So I think that's why there hasn't been too much yet. I just on this issue of transgender, I was just telling Harvey, I just read an article by Andrew Sullivan, which I really encourage you. He basically said that the gay marriage issue succeeded because those people, we convince people that gay men and lesbian women are basically like the rest of us. We're really normal people, and that we should be treated, we have the rights of other normal people. And I think that he said that the transgender issue is kind of the leading head of a much more radical assault on understandings of gender that really is trying to assail the sensibilities of what are called I always forget the name, cisgendered male, what's that?
Heteropatriarchy.
Yeah. So I find the interesting issue here, not so much what's happening on the ground, because not a lot, but how these issues are being framed in politics.
Yeah, I was interested in your reference to the white women's sports. And I was wondering if there's been any studies on the racial aspect of this, because obviously football and basketball are very heavily black. And when I look at, and of course there are women basketball teams which are very heavily black also, but that's probably about it among the women's sports. And if you look at some of these schools, smaller schools, when it gets to the admissions, has there been any studies as to that you're running into a conflict between these sexual objectives and racial objectives in increasing enrollments in schools?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is yes. There have been studies. So, for the number of African American women athletes, the percentage of athletes that are African American, is smaller than the percentage of most student bodies as a whole. So in other words, they're underrepresented among the athletes. That surprises most people because the most visible women's sport is basketball, and African Americans are very well represented there. There is one other sport in which African American females are well represented, and that's track. But in almost everything else, not at all. So that is a concern. And the other thing I'd say is that this has been a particularly serious problem for historically black colleges and universities because they are now overwhelmingly female. And at a place like Grambling, the big draw is, number one, the football team for males. Big draw is the football team and the band. And they don't have a chance of getting to parity without eliminating the football team. So what you're doing is making some of these schools less attractive for the men, which is going to create a vicious cycle, reducing the attendance of men and making them overwhelmingly female. And like, once again, guys are not doing well. Guys are not doing well in education, and it means that they're not doing well economically. I'm not saying we should do anything to reduce the educational opportunities of women, but we got to think about why is it the guys are doing so much more poorly these days.
I wanted to say something about the cause of this great cultural shift.
Yeah.
We call it a cultural shift. And in the chapter I read, you don't say we have to take seriously rights talk, but you mention the importance of what you call progress, and that's inequality. Can you clarify that a bit? Let me just state a kind of hypothesis that the change from equality of opportunity to equality of dignity is very important. I'm not saying I know any way how to turn about this and look at it, but I wonder what you would have to say.
Well, I mean, the truth is, if you ask me to explain the cultural shift, I'm not sure that I can. I'll just point out a couple of things. First is, it's not just in the United States. It's basically every advanced industrialized democracy. There seems to be something about modernization. And so that's the first point I make. The second point is, I'm not sure I agree with you about the shift from opportunity to dignity, because I think this was just a very clear-cut case of equality of opportunity. When women couldn't get into certain schools and programs, and when the women professors were really, say had second-class citizenship was really an understatement. I'm thinking of Dita Schlar here, who, how long was she a lecturer when she's really had a very distinguished record. So I think, in some ways, I think the strength of it because there were, legitimate arguments that this was denial of the most basic opportunity rights. And then the question, how did it shift?
I may say so, your explanation doesn't account for the attack on stereotypes.
Yes.
And the movement from sex to gender.
Yes.
It's a great problem of principle.
Right. No, I agree completely. And so there are these two changes. One, which I think is a very broad, popular shift of equal opportunity. And then I guess I will maybe a bit of a hyperbole to say that I think that was hijacked in the courts and agencies by a much different understanding, which is the one I pointed out about. That all of this had to be an attack on stereotypes and patriarchy. And that, I think, is the most, was possible because the system is so convoluted and so lacks transparency that these more radical ideas could be injected in ways that most people didn't notice. I don't know if that might be a little slightly more adequate.
On sexual harassment and sex crimes, I guess, given the difficulty of requiring institutions to eradicate bad behavior, is there any support at all for turning this over to police and law enforcement and getting the institutions out of it and saying, we just can't do this?
Yeah. Well, many people have argued that. That requires investigations and expertise in criminal matters that universities don't have. And if you look at the record of some places, you say, "Wow, universities are really lousy at this." However, actually, I don't accept that. I don't agree with that for the reason that number one, a criminal case requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you require that, then there's a lot of, I think, quite egregious behavior that would not be touched. And the second thing I say is that when you have less severe penalties, then you can have a somewhat diminished burden of proof. There are a lot of things that we say on college campuses really are forbidden, like plagiarism, that are not criminal. I think if colleges had reasonable procedures, which most do not have now, that I think that would be a fine way of policing their own expected behavior. I don't want to say they're having huge problems, but I think viewing this simply as a criminal matter unnecessarily gives away authority that schools should have, and I wish they'd use it more carefully.
What about returning to conduct unbecoming as the standard?
Yeah. Well,
yeah, just to follow up on that, in recent years, some male students have sued universities for throwing them out for sexual harassment and gotten big payouts from the university's insurers. Has that helped to push things the other way, or, I mean,
yeah,
you talked about tort liability.
Sure, yeah. I just want to emphasize the first point. Many students who have been found guilty of sexual misconduct have sued the university for their lousy process, and they've won. There have been a lot of these, about 50 or 60 of these. As a matter of fact, the insurance group that represents universities and these things said universities have never lost so many cases before. And this is really quite, and I think it has forced some schools to change their procedure somewhat. And now they're going to have a lot of the debate focused around cross-examination and the standard of truth, whether preponderance of the evidence or something else like that. OCR made it really hard for them to raise their burden of proof, but now those regulations aren't enforced. So the combination of withdrawal of the guidelines and this litigation threat might have some effect, largely on the margin of the procedures that are used.
thought they were actually paying out more to these men that they expelled than to women
I think that's,
for not doing it.
yes, I think that is almost definitely true, because the number of suits that have been brought by women claims that their cases have been mishandled. There aren't that many of those, because most of these are handled administratively. So you're right about that.
Shouldn't corporations have to police this behavior too?
Yes, they do. Right. So as I said, these regulations that first appeared were based on Title VII. And Title VII applies to corporations and their employees. What's notable about the current Me Too thing is that some of these really egregious cases, there are these processes in place at all of these corporations to make complaints, but they weren't being used. So if I had to make one change, I would say that prohibit corporations from paying hush money to these women, really. Because we're paying you big money, and you're supposed to keep your mouth shut, and we'll do this over and over again. I find that disgraceful.
Well, maybe you can say to prevent college from paying hush money.
Yes.
They had a hush fund or something like that.
Right, good point. Right.
Government does it all the time.
Yeah. No, so.
I have two quick questions for you. One is about sexual harassment, sexual misconduct. The other is about transgender. On the sexual misconduct issue, I mean, it seems to me that many of the people who criticize some of these rules promulgated by OCR are doing so by looking to criminal law or understandings of sex, rape, sexual misconduct from criminal law, and using that as a standard or appealing to that. My question is about the other way. Is there a way in which, do you think there's a way in which some of the norms and understandings of kind of what's brewing culturally inside universities and educational institutions will start filtering back into criminal law and change criminal law? That to me seems much more problematic or dangerous than what's going on college campuses. Regarding the transgender issue, I mean, here the question is there a is there a limit on these policies purely because of the bad logic of some of the legal arguments being made? So for instance, using OCR's 2016 guidelines, if Jacob and I wanted to use the women's room, and I mean, look at us, we're pretty manly men, I think. But let's say Jacob identifies as a girl, and I don't. If he wants to use the women's room, he's allowed to. If I want to use it because I identify as a man, I'm not allowed to. So meaning if a school wants to comply with that kind of gender identity regulation, it's forced to literally discriminate on the basis of gender identity, because the only thing distinguishing us is gender identity. So that seems to me like a logical limit on these kinds of regulations. So then the question is, so where does this lead? Does it lead to only unisex bathrooms? Because I think logically that's where this is going. Does it lead to, how is this going to transform our understanding of privacy? Does privacy have anything to do with the body anymore? And what is that going to have? What kind of effects does that have on the law and on social practices?
Good question. Leor is writing his dissertation on some of these issues, so he knows more about some of these issues than I do. On the criminal law, you're absolutely right. I mean, there have been a variety of efforts to change the criminal law to substantially reduce the burden of proof and the definition of sexual assault and the various procedures. This turned out to be a really contentious issue. There was one of these task forces that was set up by the ABA to look at sexual crimes, and they came back with a report recommending really big changes in criminal law. Now, this would not be binding as recommendations to the states, but they met a big blowback, big opposition, and that actually was withdrawn largely from criminal defense lawyers who are really concerned about. I mean, we do have this thing that I think most people, I certainly agree that we've incarcerated too many people, but is this kind of tough on any sex crime really goes against that, and the race issue really comes up quite directly here. On the transgender, I just say that I was on a panel last week with someone who'd worked in the Obama Justice Department, had written a suit basically arguing that Title IX required these regulations. And I made this argument about sex. What can sex mean gender identity, or gender identity means sex, and he basically he said, well, I wrote this brief in the case, to really explain this. I read it, and I can't make a head nor tail out of it. Because there's constant switching back between the sex discrimination is gender identity discrimination, but sex is not equal to gender. And, you read these court decisions on this, and I come completely baffled about what people mean.
Do you have any regrets of using the word gender in the subtitle of your book?
You have tried to make me have regrets about that. And I actually decided, the subtitle is Regulating Gender Equality. In some ways, I figured it was really showed I was talking about emerging issues. Anna?
The issue of promoting female athletes and the transgender issue, do they intersect? In practical cases, it's been a long time since I read about transgender athletes on a women's team. I mean, that's usually the way it goes, not the other way around. Other cases where that has become a problem, or what will schools do about that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting issue that I don't know a lot about. I will say that in the OCR regulations, they said sports subject to kind of reasonable, methods of determining some kind of wishy-washy language. And I understand the NCAA has put a whole set of rules about how you would determine who can be on what team. I haven't followed, but I assume that if these rules, no, I haven't read it yet. This issue came up at the end. I really wanted to finish this book, there is this come up in the Olympics, right? West German alleged women athletes, and sometimes that there's some real questions about complicated things about genetics and hormones, but that's not what most of this is about. It strikes me that if the courts continue in their current path of saying Title IX requires you respect gender identity, this is going to be the leading issue.
But it's not yet.
It has not been
because
yet.
The numbers are too small, effectively.
Well, yeah, because the numbers are small, but then the question becomes, how long do you have to identify as transgender? If the day before you sign up for a sport, you say, well, I identify as female, and I want to, I'm 6'6" and like to play basketball. I think there's a lot of opportunity for mischief.
As a helpful piece of information on that front, I think I read not long ago that the reigning state champion in some track event in Connecticut, maybe the 100 or 200 meter dash in high school, varsity, was a young man. And the saddest thing about reading the article was reading the young woman who got second place in the women's running event, because she knew that she couldn't say anything. And so she congratulated the winner on his victory. But I wanted to ask, in light of things like that happening, did you find during the transformation of Title IX any actual sort of populist opposition to this? Especially if the main people benefiting from this are probably the daughters of senators who play sports like badminton and who row crew. There's probably not too many normal Americans who are rowing crew for Harvard, which just is the sport I pick because that's how we balance here the funding with football, is buying very expensive equipment and boats for the women's crew. So did you see anyone taking issue with that clear sort of corruption?
First of all, I said my daughter rowed crew, and she's normal. But right, So
if I was on the campaign trail, I might use you as a case study. Professors are packing the schools with their kids.
Right. No, but let me kind of back up a little bit. That one of the things driving the expansion of regulation has been the race sex analogy. So we'll say, for example, the argument that harassment is discriminatory started in race. I mean, it was easy to say that. If you have to put up with racial epithets all the time, you could be forced out of the job, and that strikes me as a relatively strong argument for saying that that type of racial harassment ends up being discriminatory. And sometimes the race-sex analogy works, but in many other times it doesn't. We don't have black and white football teams, and for obvious reasons. This was brought home to me. In 1968 was when Yale decided they were going to go co-ed, and it happened that the day that they announced that, I had an interview in the admissions office at Yale, and the place was a complete madhouse because every alumna in the country was calling up to get their daughter or their niece or their friend an interview. I almost didn't get my interview, which would have been quite discriminatory. But it struck me that no one stood in the door at Yale and said, gender segregation now, gender segregation forever, because everybody thought, well, I could have an interest in this, which is quite different from the way in which that desegregation of race took place. So that's a huge difference. Now, the question, was there any kind of populist reaction? I guess what's surprising is how little there's been. In 2000, there were a group of people who had basically tried to get all the Republican candidates to sign a statement saying that they were against gender quotas for athletics. Alan Keyes signed it, Harvard's former student, and I think one other minor candidate signed it, but no one else did. They don't want to touch the issue, in part because if you look at polling data, even conservative Republicans think that this is a pretty good idea, gender equity in athletics. But of course, the question is, what does that mean? And most people don't kind of get down into the details. I'll just tell you one other story about crew. I realize to some extent I didn't answer your question, but I'll divert attention by telling a story about crew, which is because football has so many players, it's like 100, 110 players, you've got to have a lot of other women to balance them. So you either create 6 new teams, or you do something that has lots of members, and crew is one because you can put novice rowers in, become lost. Arizona State did this. They built. Now, think of this is in Phoenix. It's a desert. So they built a 2-mile trench basically for the crew, and there was not a single crew team at the high school crew. I shouldn't say crew team. Crew in all high schools in Arizona. So the coach would walk around the dining hall looking for tall women, and that's how you got in the crew. So I said that, this is a great study of what happens when you have regulation. So you have to have something to count, and it has all of these unintended consequences, and then you have a lot of litigation of those consequences.
So sexual harassment and sex crimes are remedied by civil rights, and it's linked to that. And with the Dear Colleague letter of 2011, and the regulations for that standard, I believe it's preponderance of doubt standard, and it was rescinded under Betsy Paul's, and or the Department of Education, they kind of wavered and changed it to schools deciding now to do either preponderance of doubt or clear and convincing standard, which is similar to, I think, something a gentleman over there mentioned about the criminal high burden proof of standard. So my question to you is just, how do you feel that kind of burden of proof or the now lack of clarity, how do you think that's going to play out, especially with again, schools kind of deferring to the OCR guidelines, so if administrative, if it's been rescinded, I don't know, I'm just trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I don't think anyone knows the answer. So here's OCR in 2011, 2014 said you must use preponderance of the evidence standard, which is slightly more likely than not. So if you find a woman slightly more credible than a male, then you have to find that there's been sexual misconduct. Some schools had previously had a clear and convincing evidence standard, which is somewhat higher, not up to beyond a reasonable doubt. I think Harvard used to have clear and convincing, and now they rolled over and did preponderance. Except at the law school. I mean, it's an interesting story. The law school said, we're not going to go along with what the rest of Harvard did. We're going to require allow opportunities for lawyers and cross-examination, and they really opted out. And OCR had said before, every university has to have uniform standards, but they said, well, maybe not. But what's going to happen? So Betsy DeVos withdrew the guidance and said, they had this statement, I believe said you could use preponderance, you can use clear and convincing, but we're going to go through notice and comment rulemaking to determine this. Now, I remember when she announced that, a reporter called me and said, well, is it going to take a month or two? And I said, this is going to take a year or two, or maybe more. And she announced this in September. They have not started yet. So I think it's going to take a couple of years before. My guess is that they will say you can use preponderance, clear and convincing. We're not going to determine the standard. How much, big question is how detailed they're going to try to be. And it's really hard to tell. But I will say that now that most schools have gone to preponderance of the evidence, unless they're forced by the court suits that you mentioned, they probably, the status quo is going to maintain itself unless there's some real big pressure to change. The only other thing I'll say is that has been the most heated argument, and I think that tends to be more of a symbolic argument, the real argument, because I think that there are all these other issues about cross-examination, about the presentation of evidence, and I think that's really kind of been a symbol for all these other things. But I'll say one more thing on that. I think by far the worst thing that OCR has pushed, and they did this sub rosa, they basically did negotiations, is a single investigator model, which says that that the Title IX coordinator will appoint someone who will investigate and will make the determination of guilt. And that can only be appealed on the basis of new evidence or procedural error. So, and what does the Title IX, what are the incentives of the Title IX coordinator? To show the federal government we're really cracking down. So if you want to have an impartial adjudicator, that's not the way to do it. And that, I think, is probably the one that's going to be most likely to change.
We have to stop, but today we've seen what it means to know your subject. Thanks very much, Shep.